everybody. Welcome back from lunch. If you could take your seats. So firstly, for those people that put questions into Slido, thank you. And during the afternoon, if you've got questions, please do continue to put them into Slido. Lisbeth has another reflection from the floor and then a personal reflection. So if I hand over to you.
So please tell us who you are.
My name is Pia, and I'm from Matic. And I think that we had some really strong stories this morning. I was actually quite emotional about especially the personal stories. But a lot of this we already know, a lot of data, a lot of knowledge, lessons learned. How come that we are not better at sort of putting those things into change management? My personal thought was that maybe we all need to work on our listening skills. Going back, at least I will think, both as working with HSE and also in management, that we need to empower people to come back with their concerns, and maybe also some of their thoughts about not just health and safety. And I think that we all think we do that, but maybe we do not pay attention enough, and I'll definitely work on that.
Great, great. And start to notice what are the subtle narratives that we use that suppress people speaking up, because you can hear them everywhere when you start listening. Thank you so much, Nina. Lisbeth?
Yes, I was reflecting on one of the things that Mark mentioned, was that they made sure that every team, everyone in that business is on the same level on safety. And it made me think how they do that. I mean, do they share everything? And it made me also wonder in the industry, like the oil and gas industry here, but also some of the other industries represented here, do we share enough? I know in the oil and gas business we say we share, but do we share enough? Like, are there webinars that can be opened up where we share and we can open up to more people? Are all the small contractors to contractors actually participating? Because they're the ones out there, even their managers as well. So that's what I thought about over lunch.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And feel free to keep adding words to Slido, adding any questions. And we are now going to move on to the next talk. If you've been wondering what the secret of safety is, you're going to get the answer now. So it's strengthening the resilience potentials. I said to you that I was super excited about the speakers. So Erik Hollnagel is somebody whose writing has influenced my thinking greatly. And when I heard he was speaking here, I was a little bit like a fan, you know. It's like, I've done that with a couple of great safety thinkers or great thinkers. So I'm a little bit like in awe of him and his intellect. And he's made a definite personal contribution to my own development. So for those of you that don't know, Erik has written numerous books. I asked him how many. He said 26, and I nearly fell on the floor. But he's a renowned author. He's a professor emeritus from 3 different universities. He's recognized as a global thinker in resilience. So without any further ado, I'll hand you over to Erik. We want to give him a hand. We can welcome him.
Thank you. I'm on, yes. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me to come here. And as others have said, it's great actually to be in a room with people again and not just looking at a screen. As sort of a precaution, I should say, I'm not going to talk about accidents. I don't think it's particularly interesting to talk about accidents, and I don't think you learn very much from accidents. So I'm going to talk about something, well, I need to have an interesting title, so that's what I thought of this, Secret of Safety, Systemic Potential Management. But it's still about safety, and of course the question is, why are we so concerned about safety? And I think it's because it's something that's in us as human beings. That's why I have this drawing up there of people in Stone Age fighting mammoths. I mean, they felt unsafe and they didn't want to be harmed. If you take the triangle there, this is a famous pyramid of needs by a great psychologist, Abraham Maslow, and it's noticeable that at the bottom are physiological needs, but the second level are safety needs. So it's really, really fundamental in us. We need to be safe, and that's why we are so concerned about it and talk so much about it and write so much about it. And when you think about safety, if you ask people, I say, I'm a psychologist, if that was mentioned, but if you ask people about what's the first thing that comes into your mind when you hear the word safety, and I would bet that for most people it's something that has gone wrong. They think of an accident, they think of an incident, they think of a case, of a situation. So we associate safety with things that actually aren't safe, which is a bit paradoxical. And we have this famous curve, that's why we have the Task Force Zero. We want to get down to zero accidents, and there are many definitions of safety, but a generic one is a system is safe if as little as possible goes wrong, and that's what we try to bring about. And I have no disagreement with that. I think it's wonderful if as little as possible goes wrong. The question is, what's the best way to achieve that? Well, the way we normally do it is that when something happens, then first of all, we go into a state of panic, and then we say, we need to find out why did it happen? First of all, what happened? Sometimes that's not always quite clear, but second step is, why did it happen? And we look for explanations, and we have these various methods and models that we apply to understand why things happen, and we look for causes, we look for root causes, and traditionally historically we first had the technological cause. Actually, before that, the cause was God or forces of nature. But about the Renaissance, we started to realize that that wasn't sufficient. One reason for that is it's very difficult to do something about the cause if the cause is God. So then we switched to technological failures. That's easier because you can do something about it if you have a technological failure. And then in 1979, we got into human error, and in 1986, we got into, with Challenger and Chernobyl, we got into organizational culture. So we have sort of these three stable explanations that we use, and we have these models, I'm sure you know them or recognize them, of how to explain how things go wrong. So that's how we do. And when something goes wrong, we get, the top is simply taken from a press release. It says, "This was a tragic accident that should never have happened," the airline said. Have you heard that before? "We assume full responsibility for this tragedy and express our deepest condolences to the family and are committed to supporting them. We are thoroughly investigating what occurred to prevent this from ever happening again." I think you've heard these lines before. What happened was a passenger had brought on board a dog. And the cabin crew said, no, madam, you can't have it here. You have to put it in the overhead luggage. Against the rules, by the way. Which he did. And when they landed, the dog had suffocated. Hence these headlines. But what do you think when I'm not saying it's a trivial event, and it's very sad for the dog and for the lady who owned the dog, but I think there's a lack of proportion in the response there, and it seems to me to be a standard response from that airline. Whenever something happens, you come out, you roll out this, yes, it's tragic, we'll do everything we can to find out what happened to make sure it doesn't happen again. That's a mantra that we all live by. So, of course, we should try to become better at what we do and learn. And therefore, it's important to see what do we actually do when we try to learn things. And And what happens is when something has happened, we look at it, we look back, hence the Janus head here. We look back and look at what happened, and we look at what people did, and we pay attention to accidents and incidents and failures and mistakes. And we say, well, why did this happen? What was missing? Was it situation awareness? Was it safety culture? Was it design features? Was it resilience? Whatever. Because it's so nice if you can point to something and say, well, this was missing. Then the solution is very simple. Provide whatever was missing. That's why safety culture is so popular. You just say, oh, it's a lack of safety culture. Oh, it's a lack of communication. Well, then we just provide what was missing and the problem has been solved, perhaps. And when we look ahead, we should say, we look ahead and say, what should we do the next time this happens? Because things always happen again. And how can we avoid the same failures and mistakes if there were failures and mistakes? How can we provide what was missing if something was missing? And that's how we think about it. And this is has been very effective up to a certain limit, about 20 years ago. It's very simple. It's a simple way of thinking about things. That's why we like to do it. Because we have simple minds, myself included. I'm perhaps the best example of a simple mind. We have simple minds and we like simple ways of thinking and simple ways of explaining and understanding. And it's also easier to explain. So we all agree, when we're here today, why would you otherwise be at a Zero Accident Vision conference? We all agree that the focus should be on accidents. We should try to understand accidents, we should try to find out why they happen, and we should try to make sure that they don't happen. And again, I'm in complete agreement with that. As like anybody else, I don't want accidents to happen. I want to be free from accidents, but I think there's another way to do it than the way we normally do. So the way we manage safety is normally this. You can illustrate the situation that we want by the beaker there on the right-hand side. And the beaker contains what goes wrong, hence red. We had an interesting discussion last night about the meaning of red and green. But in this case, red means bad. It's like blood. And we want nothing like that. So the goal is to empty the beaker. There's nothing in it, zero accidents. And the way to do that is to say, whenever something happens, we try to analyze that. And we try to understand that, because then we think we can fix it, we can prevent it from happening again, and then we are safe. So that's the way to safety. Reduce things that go wrong. This is the way we have been doing it for a couple of 100 years. And it works generally well. Today it works less well than it did before, but it works. So that's sort of the mantra. And the important thing is we rarely stop to think about that. We just do it because we are required to do it by laws, by authorities, by policies, by company mission statements, by ethics or whatever. But if you look at it, then you can look at it in this and say, what are we actually doing? Well, we are looking at snapshots of how the system worked, snapshots when it failed. So if you take this diagram and you have the line here that's called the limit of unacceptable performance, what we're looking at are events that are below the limit of unacceptable performance, completely unacceptable events. But we also know they're random, they're not systematic, and they're rare, they're very infrequent. We look at them, we study them, we analyze them, we try to explain them, we try to find the causes. But above the line of unacceptable performance, that's where we have acceptable performance. And as you can see, I've indicated, drawn a lot of green wavy lines there to indicate that what happens there are that there are many things that happen. They are all variable to some extent. Nothing is like clockwork, like machine-like. It's all variable, adjustable. I mean, we sort of find ways of doing things. But when that works, then we're safe because we're above the line. And the question is, could we look at that instead of only looking at what's below the line? Why don't we look at it when things go well and try to understand how they go well, instead of look at things when they fail and try to understand how they fail? And a young colleague of mine had this brilliant analogy. She said, is it possible to understand what a happy marriage is by analyzing and learning from divorces alone? If you ask that question, I think the answer is fairly straightforward. No, it's not possible. If you want a happy marriage, and who doesn't, you shouldn't look at what other people did wrong, but you should look at what other people do right, what makes a good marriage. But you can take the same argument again, and you can just change the word slightly and say, is it possible to understand what safety is by analyzing and learning from accidents and incidents alone? And by analogy, the answer is no, that's not possible. Of course it's not possible. So we need to look at something else. And, and I'm sort of supported in this, of course, because great minds, I just have two of them here, have said the same, and mind you, many years ago, but nobody paid attention to it at the time. James Reason, the father of the Swiss cheese model, which you all know, said in 21 years ago, safety is defined and measured more by its absence than by its presence. Because when there's an accident, we say there's a lack of safety. Safety was missing. But actually, shouldn't we define something by when it's there instead of by when it's not there? Carl Weick said even earlier, 1987, said reliability, or you could say safety, is a dynamic non-event. It's an ongoing condition in which problems are momentarily under control due to compensating changes. And I think these words are very important. They are momentarily under control because we compensate all the time to what happens to make sure that we stay safe, that we stay above the line of unacceptable performance. And Weick also said that reliability, safety is invisible, particularly in the second meaning there. He said, safety is invisible because reliable outcomes are constant, which means there's nothing to pay attention to. That's part of our biology, so to speak. Things that are constant, we notice them when they're new, but after a while we stop paying attention to them. Like the hum of the air conditioning here. Like when you know those, if you come to a different town and check in the hotel, you hear sounds. And the first night it's very annoying. I mean, I like in the good old days when I traveled, I went to Australia. I always liked to go to have a hotel by the beach, and facing the beach. And the first night I said, oh, all these waves, why do they keep breaking and so? But the second night and the third night, well, it's not like the waves disappeared; they were still there. But I got used to it. So things that are constant, we get used to, and things that go well happen all the time. So we get used to them, which means we don't pay attention to them. We don't notice it any longer. But accidents we notice because they're unusual. So you can look at it in this way and say, well, what do we do? You take this pie chart and you say, and here we have red and green again. Most of the pie is green, it's good. And then we have one event, 1 out of 10,000, 100,000, whatever you like, which is red. And what do we do when we deal with safety? We look at the event that went wrong. We look at it, it's easy to see, it attracts attention. It's difficult not to notice it. It's very infrequent, we know that. We say that it has simple causes, that's why we try to find the root cause. In fact, it doesn't have simple causes, and I think that the examples we've heard today, so far, Grenfell, Challenger, Formula One, shows that there's also a long history going back. It's never simple. It's a very complicated set of interlacing causes that interact and set up these conditions where something eventually will go wrong. So, in fact, I think we've learned that explanations are never simple. And we have this find-and-fix attitude. But what we do is we learn what does not work. But if you look at the pie, most of it is green. Most of it works. But we don't learn from it. We don't pay attention to it. One reason is it's difficult to see, because it happens all the time. Nobody pays any attention to things that just go well, because, well, they're supposed to go well, aren't they? That's what should happen. So why worry about it? It's like we say, if something happens that shouldn't happen, then we say, oh, that's contrary to my expectations. That means I must have misunderstood something. I therefore have to look at it. If something happens that should happen, then we reason, well, that's what should have happened, and that proves that my understanding is correct. Unfortunately, that's a logically false conclusion. We can't conclude in that way, but that's what we do. So when you look at it, when you look around and look at what Carl Weick called the non-events, if you look at your everyday life, it's full of non-events. In fact, it's nothing but non-events. It's nothing but things work as they should and things are as they should on the building side, when you walk in a crowd of people, when you go to a pharmacy, when you go to a supermarket. When you go to a supermarket and you want to pick something off the shelf, and if it's there, you just pick it off the shelf and you go on and continue. If it's not there, you stop and say, well, that's strange. Why isn't it there today? What's wrong with them? What's wrong with their logistics system? Or why haven't they planned for that? And so on. But you never stop to think about, it's a small miracle that stuff is there on the shelf when it should be there. Well, if you work with the logistics, you know it's a big miracle, actually. And it's a very intricate set of processes and functions that lie behind that. But usually we just take it for granted. And we get used to it, so we only notice when it doesn't work. So that leads to another way of looking at safety. And if you use a beaker analogy again, then we say, well, actually, now we fill it up with things that go well, the green. And the purpose of safety is to make sure as much as possible goes well. Not to prevent things from going wrong, but to ensure that they go well. So it's the opposite way of thinking. The result is the same. In fact, the result, because if this is full, then you have 0 accidents. But not because you have studied the accidents, but because you have studied things that go well and worked to make sure that things go well. So it's the end result is the same, but the way you get there is completely different. Because the logic is, of course, that in our macroscopic world, and I know in the quantum world it's different, but in our macroscopic world, something cannot go well and fail at the same time. So if you can make sure it goes well, then it means that it doesn't fail. I didn't say that before, but you can see on the left-hand side I call it safety 2, and the previous one I called safety 1, because that's what happened when resilience engineering came into being about 20 years or so ago, 15, 20 years ago. And people started to realize that there was another way of looking at safety. And to talk about it, you need to have a label, you need to have a name. And then after a while, we came up with, not very brilliant, I realized that, but we called it safety 1 and safety 2. Mind you, we were clever enough, we thought, to use Roman 1 and Roman 2, not to lead people into thinking, oh, it's 1, 2, and you can have 1.5 and 1.6 and 2.2 and so on. We said, no, these are categories. So it's safety 1 and safety 2. In retrospect, even that was a mistake, but there you have it. So how do you manage that? Because that's a question. If you accept that, well, it would be good, wouldn't it, to make sure that things go well? I mean, that's what you're in the business for, aren't you? That's what business is, that things go well. That's when you make the money. That's when you are happy customers. So what should we do to make sure that things go well? We should still ask when we have accidents, of course, why did this happen? And try to understand that, but it's not sufficient. We also need to say, well, how do things go well? Do we really understand how they go well? What can we do to make sure that they go well in the future? So if you go back to this drawing here, you can say, I've called it the gray lines green now, and said, well, because if you are above the limit of unacceptable performance, then you are safe. So what happens up there? How can we study that? How can we work on that? How can we use that? How can we facilitate that? How can we manage that? How can we strengthen that? And the honest question is, do we understand why work goes well? And if you're really honest, I think you'd have to say in most cases, no, we actually don't. But it goes well, and we all know that. But we're not really sure. Why? When we look at it, and this is what resilience engineering has been doing then for the last 15 years or so, I say, what happens when things go well? Why is it that work goes well and that we have the outcomes that we would like to have and that we need? Then we find that, well, we can actually try to explain it in a relatively simple manner, and you always have to simplify things, of course, but for ourselves and for others, also to make it manageable, you have to simplify it. So we simplify it and say, well, there are 4 things you have to be able to do, and we talk about them, we call them potentials. You have to be able to respond in a flexible way. If something happens, we have to be able to respond, and we heard lots of examples about that today, both good examples from Formula 1 and bad examples from other cases of the inability to respond, and we know it's fatal if you cannot respond. So you have to be able to respond, you have to have the potential to respond, your organization, your company. You have to be able to monitor, to keep track of what's going on. You have to know what's happening. You have to be able to learn, not only from what doesn't work, but to learn from what works. Because how can you become better if you don't know what you do well? And you have to be able to anticipate, to look ahead, to look further beyond the situation, look into the future and say, what could possibly happen? How can we possibly prepare for that? And I think the pandemic is a wonderful, that's probably the only wonderful thing about it, it's a wonderful illustration of the need to anticipate. And that's what everybody is doing now, like crazy, and say, well, what's going to happen? Are we going, when winter sets in here, are we going to get a 3rd wave? Well, I can't keep track of how many waves we've had. 3rd wave or 4th wave here in Denmark and other countries. What's going to happen next year? Will there be a new variant of the virus? And how can we prepare for that? And how can we see early signs of that? So the ability to anticipate is really, really crucial. But resilience engineering has sort of taking this and say, well, this is a simplified way of looking at things, but it makes a lot of sense, a lot of practical sense also. Another thing that's come up in discussions also is that we need signals, and recently there's been a lot of discussion about so-called strong signals and weak signals, because people have realized that weak signals are really important. Strong signals are, I mean, in classical signal detection theory, are signals that are above the detection threshold, and you notice them, like accidents are a strong signal. You notice them, they're easy to see, but they're like snapshots. But they're also weak signals, that is, things that you don't notice. And when you think about them, they can be weak for two reasons. One is that they are actually weak in the sense that the energy in the signal is so low that it is not detectable by the sensors or the measurement systems, whatever you have. Another example is it's weak because they're stretched over time. They happen so slowly that we don't notice them. And just as a simple example, if you take a picture of a plant, that's a snapshot, that's here and now. But you know all these films you have of plants that grow over a day, or a week, or a month, or longer time. If you take these pictures every now and then and put them together in a film, you can see the change over time, but you can't see it in real time because that time of development of that doesn't match with the way our brains, our perceptual apparatus work. But much of what we talk about in organizations, safety among other things, develops so slowly that we don't notice the change, and therefore it's a weak signal. And we need to pay attention to the weak signals. We need to be able to see the weak signals because they're critical to what we do. So how do we do that? Well, as I said, we have these ideas of what they call the four potentials to respond, to monitor, to learn, and to anticipate. And this boils down to a definition of what resilient performance is. When we started, we talked about resilience, but I don't talk about resilience now as a noun, but I talk about resilient performance, resilient as an adverb. And a system is resilient if it's able to function as required under expected and unexpected conditions alike. And the unexpected conditions are not only dangers and risks and harm, they're also opportunities. And you know that the business has to be able to make use of opportunities that pop up and be able to anticipate opportunities. Otherwise, it's not going to do well in the long run. So that's the gist of it in resilient engineering. We need to look at these four potentials, and we need to look at them at all levels of an organization. And conventionally, we split between the micro level, the meso level, and the macro level. But this is sort of arbitrary because there aren't three clear levels, but clearly there are different levels or different strata of organizations. But the nice thing about thinking about the four potentials to respond, to monitor, to learn, and to anticipate is that they apply at all levels of an organization. On the board level, on the management level, on the operational level, on the department level, they are scale invariant, which is a very nice feature of the three. Why do we need them? Sorry, the four, what am I talking about? Why do we need them? Well, I think I've tried to argue that already, but it's fairly easy to argue them. Well, of course you need to respond, and I think we've heard again today examples of systems, organizations that were unable to respond appropriately, and then it fails. Then you go out of business or you die in the worst case. A business death or a personal death, whatever, it's equally tragic. So of course you need to be able to respond. That's easy to understand. And every organization can respond to some things, not to everything. You need to be able to monitor. And the reason for that is very simple, because if you don't monitor and know what's going on, then everything that happens will be a surprise. And if you can just think about your daily work life, if everything that happened from the moment you stood up in the morning or came to work in the morning was a surprise, you wouldn't be very effective, and you wouldn't really be able to respond. We're only able to respond if we are not surprised all the time, but we are able to prepare and look ahead. Again, learning, you have to learn, and because if you don't learn, then you always respond in the same way. And you always look at the same things to monitor. And unless the world around us is perfectly stable and static, which it isn't, then that doesn't work. That's why we have to learn. And we have to learn from what we do well, but also from what we don't do well. And again, we have to anticipate, we have to understand that the future is not a repetition of the past. We actually don't know what happens in the future. So we have to be prepared for that, and it's essential to anticipate, at least so we sort of have an open mind and can consider things that might happen and what should we do possibly to prepare ourselves for that. So the next question is, if you want to use this, how can we use it? And the answer is you can use it by assessing it, by asking questions. How well are we able to XXX? But you can't ask questions like how well are we able to respond, how well are we able to monitor, and so on, because that's too high level. It doesn't make sense. But you can easily break it down into more detailed questions. Take learning. You can say, well, what do we base our learning on in our organization? Is our learning event-driven? So when something goes wrong, is it continuous? How long time does it take? How do we verify that something has been learned? How do we maintain that something has been learned? So you can easily break it down into detailed, specific, very operational questions. For a specific organization, it'll be different for different organizations. It's not a standard questionnaire. But you can do that, and you can ask the questions, and you can get the answers. And therefore, you can assess how well is my organization doing with regard to these potentials and the detailed facets of the potentials at any point in time, which means you can follow what's happening. You can keep track of how it's developing. And that's the essence of controlling something or managing it. You need to know your position. You need to know where you are at the moment. Because if you don't know where you are, well, then you're lost. You need to know where you are, you need to know where you want to be, and you need to know how to get from where you are to where you want to be. That's what you all did successfully when you came here this morning. I hope you knew where you were when you woke up. You knew where you were going to be here, and you knew how to get here. I walked from the hotel. It was very simple. So what we have developed is a system which we call the systemic potentials, which are a set of questions. The questions are seed questions. They're not the questions to be asked, but they're seed questions that you can use to develop specific questions for your organization. And add questions to or remove questions from them, that's okay. You end up with a set of questions which are specific for your organization, which are diagnostic for the organization, and which are formative in the sense that the answers can be used almost immediately as a basis for deciding what to do. How to react, how to intervene, how to improve, how to sustain. So we can do that. It's fairly easily done, and a nice feature of that, this is, there are other ways of doing it, but you can, if you take this is for the potential to respond, and if you look at the questions, you can say, well, there are questions in this case with regard to the threshold, the relevance, the background, the number of events you can respond to, the stop rule. That's very important when you respond, is not just how quickly can you start, but also do you know when to stop? Because you don't want to stop too early, and you don't want to continue beyond the point where you should have stopped, because that's a waste of resources. The capacity and so on. So it's just an example, but if you ask questions about each of these specific questions, you can get answers, so you can quite easily score the answers. And if you do it again 4 months later, then you actually get 2 profiles like this. And these profiles will tell you what has happened in the organization in between. It'll tell you what's your position right now. But it will also tell you the history and the development of what has happened. So it's a very useful way of thinking about how it's a tool for managing the organization, because it gives you a position and it helps you to think about what should we do to improve that. Something that, of course, is terribly important here is to realize that these different facets, as I call them, are not independent of each other. Neither are the 4 potentials. Respond, monitor, learn, anticipate are not independent of each other. And the detailed facets you ask here are not independent of each other. So you cannot just go in and say, oh, the event list is a problem here, let's solve that, because it has consequences for other things as well. So you need to understand how things are tied together. So coming back to this figure again, we can say, well, what should we do? And you notice I'm trying to emphasize that you say in the classical way of working it, we focus on what goes wrong. And what we're trying to do is we manage offshore safety. And that's why we talk about safety. I've heard the word safety, I don't know how many times today. So what we do is we manage safety. But I ask you, what is safety? Have you ever seen safety? What color is safety? How big is it? How heavy is it? But we still blindly talk about, we have safety management systems, which very often are defined as systems to manage safety, which is sort of a definition that doesn't make sense because it doesn't tell you what safety is. But that's what we talk about, managing offshore safety. But the consequence of the safety 2 perspective or the resilience engineering perspective is to say, no. We should talk about managing offshore safely. It's not offshore safety we manage, but it's offshore as an operation that we manage, as a business that we manage. And we should manage that business safely. There is no safety to manage. But there's a way of managing something safely so that traditionally you say as few accidents as possible. I would say so as many things as possible goes well. So that's the upshot of it. Focus on what goes well and think about managing something safely. And penultimate one, I've got 1 minute and 50 seconds left. Wow. Because we tend to talk about safety management, and depending on which kind of business you're in, you may have quality management or production management or customer management or reliability management or asset management, whatever. You have, I mean, in any organization, there'll be a number of different managements and different management heads and divisions, and they have different methods and different approaches. But really, if you think of it, you're not talking about safety management, but you're talking about managing work so that as much as possible go well. You're talking about, not talking about quality. It's not quality you're managing, but you're trying to manage what happens so that quality is as high as possible. You're trying to manage it so that so you produce as much as possible. And when you say that, then you can say, well, actually, are we managing, if you take this example, are we managing 5 different processes? Do we have 5 different companies? Or don't we actually just have one company that we have to look at from all these sides at the same time? And I think the answer is that's what we have to do. We have to look at it. It's the same system. It's not 5 different systems. That's what we have to manage. So if you're interested, just by coincidence, has been released a white paper from Eurocontrol. It's an air traffic control organization in Europe called the Systemic Potentials Management, Building a Basis for Resilient Performance. I think you can download it, and that will tell you in much more detail what I've tried to outline here. So thank you very much for your attention.